Meeting to order. Members of the public are advised that our meetings are webcast live by the City of Hamilton and temporarily archived on the city's website. Other individuals and the media may also be audibly and/or visually recording this meeting. All electronic devices are to be switched to a non-audible function during committee meetings. Madam Clerk, are there any changes to the agenda?
Yes, Mr. Chair, there are changes to the agenda. We have 2 delegation requests, and item 6.3, Nancy Silva Khan, respecting a request that the City of Hamilton appeal to the provincial government to pause the plan to change the Ontario Autism Program to allow for further consultation, and that's for a future meeting. Then we also have 6.4, Cameron Kretsch, respecting item 10.2, renewal of the Beasley Community Centre operating agreement, report CS 13018C for today's meeting.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. May I have a mover and a seconder to approve? Moved by Whitehead, seconded by Pauls. All in favor, and it's an electronic vote. Okay. And that carries. Are there any declarations of interest? And a reminder that if you have a conflict of interest or an interest to prevent a conflict, you will have to complete a municipal conflict of interest declaration form in addition to declaring their interests at meetings as required by Section 5 of the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. Now, hearing none, may I please have a mover and a seconder to approve the minutes of March 21st, moved by Johnson, seconded by Clark. All in favor, and this is an electronic vote. And that carries. May I please have a mover and a seconder to approve the minutes of the March 20, sorry, may I please have a mover and a seconder to approve the delegation request, Ruth Greenspan, and that's moved by Paul, seconded by Whitehead. All in favor, and it's an electronic vote. Okay, vote completed. On 6.2, it's Paul Eppingham, Ancaster Minor Hockey, respecting the protection of interests and availability of ice for the Ancaster Minor League. May I please have a mover and a seconder to approve the delegation request? Moved by Clark, seconded by Pauls. All in favor? And we have a speaker in Councillor Jackson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. General Manager Johnson, maybe if you don't have an answer today, but if you recall, Manager Steve Savor at our last meeting, Mr. Chairman, did an outstanding presentation about outdoor facilities, availability of time. I believe he also tied in arenas, indoor arenas, and about where the growth is, you know, how to balance the needs of prime time, sport field availability, ice time for the arenas. So I'm only curious, and Paul, if you don't have an answer today, just to take under advisement, here's one now. Remember, some of us were wondering how much consultation he's done in the community. Steve said him and his team has taken 2 years plus to do a lot of consultation, I think with close to 200 stakeholders, groups overall, that put on great sports programs across our city. And now here's one wanting to protect the interest and availability of the ice and wants to appear. So maybe it'll be for the next 2 weeks, and at that time, maybe in the interim, Mr. Chairman, staff can meet with this individual just to understand what the possible concern might be, Mr. Chairman. Can I just ask for you to, Paul, possibly that he'll take that under advisement, maybe have an answer for us before the next meeting, please?
Through the chair, I can imagine they've already spoken to this organization, but if they haven't, we will definitely before the delegation comes forward.
Perfect. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, and we have Councillor Whitehead next.
Just on that, it'd be nice if we can have a breakdown of this organization's hours, what is blocked and what is actually being used. Because that is the context of the conversation we need to have.
So through the chair, since this is for a future meeting, so it's not happening on the day of the meeting, I'm sure our staff will do some background work and have that available as we, we'll also understand what the nature of, it could be about facilities, it could be about the new allocation. I'm not sure what it is, so we'll track that down and have a good conversation when the delegate arrives.
Appreciate it.
Okay, So I believe the mover was Clark, and the seconder was Pauls. All in favor, and Councillor Whitehead, you're off, you're on again, but you have to turn yours off, please. Okay, and on this, and it's a recorded vote on 6.2, all in favor. Okay, moving on, we have 6.3, which is Nancy Silva Khan respecting the request that the City of Hamilton appeal to the provincial government to pause the plan to change the Ontario Autism Program to allow for further consultation. This is for a future meeting. Moved by Whitehead, seconded by Jackson. All in favor, and it's electronic vote. Now we're moving on to 6.4, and it's Cameron Kretsch, respecting item 10.2, renewal of Beasley Community Center operating agreement. May I please have a mover and a seconder? Moved by Paul, seconded by Clark, all in favor, and it's an electronic vote, and it's for today's meeting. Councillor Whitehead. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. This is in Councillor Farr's ward. We know he's away this week. Do we get any, will staff, or like I haven't seen anything from Councillor...
He did send out an email.
Okay, I haven't seen it yet. Yeah. Great. That's what I was looking for. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So on item 6.4, I believe the movers were, who did I say? Can't recall now. Thank you. So moved by Paul, seconded by Clark. All in favor, and it's electronic vote. Okay, now we're moving on to the public hearings and delegation, and I'll call 8.1, I'll call Cameron Kretsch, respecting item 10.2, which is the renewal of Beasley Community Center. Mr. Kretsch, the commandant, the floor is yours.
Very much for hearing my delegation. I appreciate it. I'm here because I use the Beasley Community Center, and that's one of the reasons I'm here. I live close by. I don't attend their programming, but I'm there for meetings and using Simone Hall quite a bit. So that's why I'm here, because I saw this on the agenda.
Excellent.
So
welcome.
I recently learned that the renewal of the contract between the City of Hamilton and Wesley Urban Ministries had been postponed. So usually this contract renewal process starts in September. It had in 2013 and 2015, but because of the municipal election, it was postponed. And so I kind of looked for it, didn't see it, and then thought it kind of happened on its own, but it turns out it's happening now. So I recently learned that it was subject to renewal today. I'm concerned about the risks to the City of Hamilton here and the community under the terms of the current arrangement. And I pause to say that this community center is run slightly as a slight anomaly if you look at the whole system of community and recreation centers, right? So that's why I'm singling this out. I want to make it really clear, though, two things. One, I'm just here as a resident speaking for myself. And two, this is not about the programming itself. So I'm not here to comment on Wesley Urban Ministries, the programming they offer, the quality of that programming. That's not why I'm here. I'm here to talk specifically about the City of Hamilton's obligations. So a brief timeline of events for all of us who haven't been steadily watching this minute by minute for the last 10 years. In November 2010, the BCC opened. In September 2013, there was a contract given to Wesley Urban Ministries. I'm not sure if it was the first one. Same thing in 2015. In 2018, the contract expired, and then now in 2019, we're going through the renewal process. So what I've done before I came here was I spoke to staff, spoke to Wesley, reviewed some past city reports, reviewed past community feedback, and then reviewed some public documents that the Wesley folks were kind enough to send me. So here I think, based on reviewing those things, here are where I think there are risks to the city. So the funding is, for me, probably the most obvious risk. The funding in this situation isn't funding from the City of Hamilton. The City of Hamilton gives around $40,000 a year for operating administrative costs. but Wesley comes up with a lot of the money to actually offer the programming. So they own it. So if anything ever happened where Wesley was no longer the service provider, the programming would stop. There's not currently in the current renewal agreement any contingency plan in place to identify or mitigate the risks to the city if that were to happen. So if programming suddenly stopped at this community center, there's no plan for how to mitigate that risk or issue. That's my primary concern. What's happened now is the situation has essentially created a monopoly, right? I'm not against that necessarily in this context, but it creates a perpetuity, right? It means that if Wesley owns the programming, then Wesley's the one that's going to offer the programming, so what's the point of renewing the contract, right? The renewal itself is kind of a strange process. So what's the mechanism for renewing the contract if it's not to provide the services? Is it for community feedback? Like, what is the renewal period for? I argue there's not been a mechanism for community feedback from the city. I know that Wesley has reached out quite a bit to the community and talked to the community about their services and the programming they offer, and it's happened over a decade. But there's not a formal process the city has right now to reach back out to the community, to look back at the last 10 years at what's been happening and get feedback before going through the renewal process. The last point is that detailed reporting is kind of lacking, in my opinion, at this point. If you look at the materials in front of you for today's meeting, they're rather brief, and I know that they'd be more lengthy when the time comes for actually signing the contract. But I think what's missing from there is information about exactly how the programming is funded and from whom, right? So who is Wesley relying upon to fund these programs, and what is the risk to the city of Hamilton? So I think that the city of Hamilton doesn't have that data and should know. So what I'm asking this committee to do is not renew this today. Now that's kind of a misnomer because no one's being asked to sign anything today, right? So going through the renewal process I think is a fine thing. I should retract that. But ask that the things I've mentioned today be built into the new contract, right? So that the staff reports back with a risk and contingency plan, that there's detailed information including specific program funding and the operating agreement, and there's a city-side plan for gathering community feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if I can ask through you, if Mr. Kretsch has an actual risk that he's truly concerned about, because it seems to be this, it's not tangible.
Right. So I think that there are a number of risks that are out there, right? I don't think anything today, I'm not sitting up at night, not sleeping, worried there's a risk. Let's be clear, I'm not. But the city of Hamilton politically could choose at any time to say, if we're going to do a request for process, a request for proposal, we're going to take the contract away from Wesley and we're going to put it out to tender. Wesley could decide for whatever reason it wants to, any reason it wants to, that it no longer wants to provide the services there and wants to provide them somewhere else. There's 100 reasons, 100 things that can happen. And there has been feedback from the community in the past when I was reading and reviewing it, asking for things like requests for proposals. So it's not outside the landscape of being a possibility at some point in the future. So I think it's important for the city to have the information in hand to be able to assess that risk before it finds itself in the situation, if it might. It's also just good to have this data, I think, right?
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, so when I'm reading through the report, do you have any concerns about the report in terms of it highlighting what has happened in the last year? And I mean, it all looks very positive. There's been an increase in hours of service. There's been a number of new partners attached to it. I don't see anything that's jumping up as a red flag for me, so.
Yeah, I'm not, as I said at the beginning, I'm not here to comment on the quality of the programming, the service hours, all that stuff. I'm not here to say that Wesley's not doing a good job. What I'm concerned about is the city of Hamilton's, their liability in the situation, right? It's a unique situation. If, let's just say, that there was some reason why Wesley stopped offering programming and the city decided to take it on, this community center has a very unique free program service for a lot of their free programs, and they tend to can comparatively offer more services than other community centers get. So then all of a sudden a relationship would be set up to say, is every community center going to get the same level of service? So again, there's all these different kinds of contingent risks to the city, I think, in situations when you have this working through a nonprofit private partner. I don't think those have been explored or put in the agreement, from what I can tell.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Clark, and we have Councillor Whitehead next.
Thank you. So we do have an email indicating that the recently elected councillor, Jason Farr, also the incumbent who's been working with BC for a long time, is in full endorsement of this report before us. I just want to put that on record because I had asked that before coming in. I guess we could find problems on almost anything. I've been pushing for the Kiwanis Boys and Girls Club that provide a very good program, especially with youth at risk and et cetera. And it would be a more or less sole source type activity. And we were looking originally at Cyril McNabb Rec Center. And when we were looking and analyzing it, they have actually greater capacity than the city of Hamilton in some regard in regards to offsets and costs and economies of scale, focus on the type of programming that they provide that's so badly needed in our community. So I'm actually looking and doing the same kind of thing, and again, more of a sole source and I've been working with city staff on that. So when I look at Wesley, Wesley's already integrated into the community in many ways. Is that not correct? Without this operation.
Yeah, definitely they are, yep.
They know the community very well.
Yeah, I would say so. I can't speak for them. They're here. But yeah, that's my understanding.
So I'm not clear, I mean, what the risks are, and I don't know if you've actually quantified that risk, because we still have an apparent responsibility to ensure that the operation and the programming continues regardless of any shortfalls. So I'm trying to understand where you see the risk.
So I guess the risk here is that the city, if that's the city's position, and it's new to me, that you have the obligation to carry on providing the programming levels that you don't own the funding for. And that's the thing. The city isn't funding these programs, right? Wesley has sought funding to fund the programs. So Wesley owns that funding. So if anything happens to the relationship with Wesley, the programming goes with it. That's my understanding, right? And so that's the inherent risk, the most obvious risk, right? I also think there are other sort of secondary risks, right? And those secondary risks are things like not having enough information about the funders and how much funding levels there are to make an informed decision, right?
So we'll ask the question of staff, but I can guarantee that any organization that the city partners with, there is due diligence on performance measures, goals, targets, and their financial capacity to deliver the service. That's all part of the process in which we consider before we enter into those partnerships. You're aware of that, right?
I'm totally aware of that, right? Absolutely get that. It's not about the programming measures at all.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Jackson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Cameron, thank you for being here. I'm just trying to, and I'll have questions for staff as well, but again, all I know is the stellar reputation of Wesley Urban Ministries, and I know you're not touching on that at all. You said that you're here on your own. What I've done so far, one of your slides, spoken to staff, spoken to Wesley Urban, reviewed past community feedback. Is there anything further beyond your own opinion that, Councillor, 5 years ago I discovered this 50-name petition of people that were concerned about contracting this out to Wesley Urban. Any further community feedback that would possibly cause concern that we should be aware of, Mr. Chairman, through you to Cameron?
The community's had a variety of feedback. People have written articles, letters. There was a delegation here in 2013, I think, from somebody on this subject. I know that people have met with Councillor Farr about this. I can't really speak to the content of that in terms of whether it's a current concern. Part of the reason I think that I'm asking for there to be community feedback is because I think that, yes, there was a fair amount of community feedback for about 5 or 6 years, and I think that it would be useful to go back out and try to engage more folks in finding out, hey, like, how do you think things are going? The results are probably likely going to be very positive. A lot of the people I've ever spoken to or seen enjoy the programs there. It's not about what the outcome of that community feedback is. It's about having that community feedback in the first place. I think there's just a bit of a gap there in terms of gathering community feedback in the last little while.
Okay, Cam, I appreciate you elaborating on that. Again, I'm not as familiar with the programming and with the relationship there. I often support and promote community partners, whether from the not-for-profit side and from the private side, similar to the 15-year relationship we've had at the Quad Pad Arena with a private-public partnership there with new stadia. But you don't want the contract be renewed today, and you want staff to look at contingency plans on that in the event Wesley Urban doesn't hypothetically follow through. This has just caught me off guard today, Cameron, I'll be honest. And again, every voice is very respectfully important. I take that seriously, but up till now, I just had not heard of any other concerns, even from a contingency standpoint. And maybe that's because Wesley Urban's had a wonderful track record overall and long-standing record in our community, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Cameron. Any closing remark, Cameron, please?
Yeah, sure. So I could turn that the other way, right? So the way I'm looking at this isn't from that perspective at all. I'm not looking at this about the reputation of Wesley Urban Ministries in the community. I'm looking at it from the risks the City of Hamilton has. There are two people in this arrangement. There's Wesley, there's the City of Hamilton. The City of Hamilton has just as much, I guess, opportunity to decide to make a change to the agreement anytime they feel so, right? And so if the City of Hamilton should politically, for any reason, decide they want to make a change to the agreement, there currently doesn't exist, I think, the data there, the information there, to properly do that in a risk-free way, or as close as you can get to risk-free, right? So I think there's more risks that can be mitigated here in understanding this before the city enters into a new agreement. And just to your other point, I'm not looking to suggest it's not renewed today, because it won't be renewed today anyways. So what's going to happen is I think you're giving permission to staff to enter into the negotiations itself. Great, please do that. But I'm suggesting that in those negotiations and when the contract itself is done, that these things be considered.
So Cameron, just the exact wording though, it's not to consider that, it actually says in A part that the agreement be renewed for an additional 3 years. So it's not to go back and talk, or we'll get that clarified from staff as well.
That was my understanding. I spoke to staff before and they said that this is the part where you're going and getting authorization to go and have those talks and to enter into an agreement, but the agreement hasn't been written yet.
Okay, thank you for your answers, Cameron. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so on that point, so that we don't have to revisit it again when the report comes, Paul, can you just elaborate on how we deal with this with other contractors? Oh, we will receive it, sorry. Moved by Whitehead, seconded by Jackson, all in favor to receive the delegation. I appreciate your input, sir. Carried. Now, Paul, can you just elaborate on the risk aspect of it and how we...
Well, through the chair, and thanks for the opportunity also just to be clear about this report today, because there's been some talk about what we're doing or what we're not doing. The recommendations as they are before you today would not have the agreement come back here. It provides me the delegated authority to go and sign an agreement in accordance with satisfactory to the city solicitor, which is really just making sure our T's and C's are in place. So there is a decision point today, and it would not be coming back to committee and council. The delegate certainly raises a risk which is inherent in our human services, our recreation services, our emergency services, period. The much larger risk for us is the $330 million we receive from the provincial government. It represents 52% of our overall budget, and as you can well imagine, I don't have much sleep these nights as I wait for April 11th. We also enter into partnerships with 690 or so community organizations to deliver much of our human and recreational services. In almost all cases, those organizations bring additional resources to the table. So as a department, and under the old system of Community and Emergency Services and Public Health, and now the merged Department of Healthy and Safe Communities, these are risks we live with every day. I can tell you from a staff perspective, this program offers an extremely low risk. If we had to step into the breach, we would in the short term, and we would look at alternative partners. But with a nearly 65-year history in terms of the organization we're working with, to be honest, the much larger risk would be the Boys and Girls Club, who also offer very low programming and have many more participants than through the Beasley piece. So we have these risks inherent, and I'm not for a minute suggesting then that the delegate hasn't raised good points. The delegates actually raised what our life is like on a daily basis. The City of Hamilton cannot offer free programming. We have, without your endorsement, so our recreation centers have a fee-based system. This is the way we go about providing good service to the community, and in targeted ways, free services to the community. Our investment would not have our homeless shelters and some of our housing programs provide all of the wraparound supports that they do. We rely on our nonprofit partners to provide us with additional resources and tap into additional resources to make our services better. So I think today has highlighted really the operating challenge that we are under on an almost daily basis. We manage it well, and our community partnerships are what make us strong as a community. So that is you know, whether it's Wesley, the Boys and Girls Club, Good Shepherd Centers, it doesn't matter. We have, as I say, nearly 700 of these partnerships across our department, and we look at each one of them and say, what's the risk that we are entering into each time? From a staff perspective, I can tell you today that we're comfortable with moving forward with this. That's why we brought it forward. And so that's a bit of context. Happy to answer some other more specific questions about this, but I think it's important to realize that this is just one of many similar type contracts and situations that we have within this community.
Thank you, Paul. And we have Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just questions to staff, if I may. So how expansive is the operational agreement with the City of Hamilton and Wesley Urban Ministries?
Through the chair, can you define the expansive part of it in terms of what they deliver on site?
Is the agreement 30 pages long with appendices, or is it a simple letter of agreement between the two parties?
More than a letter, less than 30 pages. So these are usually the ones that I've seen. I don't know the Wesley one off the top of my head. They are tend to be somewhere in the 5 to 10 page range. Most of it is our assurances that the investments we make are spent in the correct ways. There are call-off clauses, as I'll call them, on either party's part. It allows us, after a budget situation, for instance, to let them know that the funding is on an annual basis, those types of things. So we cover a lot of the legal issues. A lot of it is around liability and insurance coverage because, of course, they're operating services on our behalf, and we have to sort those types of things out. We then have the schedules of service, and in this case, it's an amalgam of services. Much of the service and much of the investment is actually around the early years and the fact that they operate in an early on center in the community. And then we have additional recreation and community programming. And then Wesley has stepped up and helped us develop some of the space and the rooms within the Beasley neighborhood. So these are they're legal documents. They're vetted through legal, which is why it's always in the form you know, the city solicitor is okay with. They're not something that we do on our own.
And the early years programming, isn't there a funding agreement there with the province also that we're attached to?
So through the chair, yes, we operate as a service system manager for Children's Services, and therefore we flow those resources out in a similar fashion with all of our childcare contracts as well. So we have an agreement with the province, and then we execute agreements with our service delivery partners.
And the last question I have, because it's been a long time since I looked at these agreements, and they're relatively simple. If this registered charity, Wesley Urban Ministries, God forbid, found themselves financially distraught, there's mechanisms within that agreement. They have to slowly divest themselves of the charitable assets they have, and the city would be able to continue to operate the programming that we have here with the agreement with the province. Is that not correct?
Through the chair, correct. In terms of the dollars that we control, which would be both the net levy dollars and provincial contracts, we would be able to, if they were no longer able to fulfill it for any reason, or just chose not to fulfill it anymore, saying we want out of that business, we would take that resource and invest it elsewhere. There are other partners that could do that work. And in the you know, the extreme event that an organization ceases to exist, and the one that I'll give you from a very recent example is Community Information Hamilton. Then we step in and we work with the funding partners, and in that case have had a seamless transition of some of their services within the library system. So both the contracts protect us. They can't take the money with them and do something else with it. We would find other parties to deliver that, or in some cases the city has to step in and do that. And I can tell you that that's what we had to do alongside our library partners in terms of Community Information Hamilton. So we actually have some recent history of having to deal with that very scenario.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, just the last thing, if you could forward me a copy of the agreement just for my own edification, just look at it and make sure that I'm not worried about something that we might have missed. I don't think they've changed from the last time I was here, so they're a relatively simple document. And there's a lot of opportunity there for the city to cover off if things disappear in terms of services all of a sudden vanish, and we have to step in to backstop it, and then we work with the provincial government accordingly. So I'm fine from that aspect, but I do appreciate the constituent coming forward and raising the concern that there may not be contingencies in play. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Councillor Pauls.
Through the chair, I want to ask Paul, it says here it is recommended that the operating agreement with Wesley Ministry be renewed for an additional 3 years with an option for another 2-year extension. Is that usually the contracts we give to, it seems short, that's all. Is that the?
So through the chair, it varies. Some are what we call evergreen contracts, which get renewed regularly, sometimes on an annual basis, but the expectation is they're renewed annually. Others have term agreements with some ability to extend them. So I will tell you that given all the agreements we have, they do vary in length. This was seen as an appropriate length of time to continue this relationship. And it is important to recognize, as the delegate also did, that this is a relatively new partnership, and it's one that's growing and emerging and doing well, as our report indicates. But this was also a case where, you know, we're buffering ourselves with, what is it, up to a 5-year commitment here that will tip also into a new term of council, and then we can come back and look at it again. So that's what we've brought forward, but I can tell you our agreements vary in terms of their length and whether they are fixed-term contracts or more evergreen contracts.
Thank you. Actually, I have a big yes to this. Go for it. That's what caught my attention, so thank you.
Thank you. We have no further speakers on this, Matt. So we're going to move on. And why don't we move up that item, which is item 10.2. So moved by Whitehead, second by Jackson, that we move the item up to deal with now. And that's an electronic vote, I presume? To move it up? No? Okay, all in favor? Carried. Now, what's before us is item 10.2, moved by Whitehead, seconded by Pauls. All in favor? Carried once we do electronic vote. Okay, and that carries. Now moving back to 6.3. No, sorry. 8, my apologies. 10.1, which is the establishment of the subcommittee of Council expanding housing and support services for women and transgender community subcommittee. And we have Councillor Jackson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And this was spawned from an earlier request, I believe, from your committee about a month or so ago. And so it's here before us. I'm fully supportive. I just on page 1 of 4 of the Appendix A at the bottom, preference will be given to female identified, non-binary, LGBTQ, identified people, persons with lived or living experience of homelessness, which is all fine. Just the word preference, and I just hope that once the, if approved today, once the subcommittee gets underway and working, I just hope that there'll be some balance on the committee. I see it doesn't say exclusive, it says preference, but I just hope there will be some balance along the way, and that this subcommittee, like Seniors Advisory, the persons with disabilities, will be reporting, Mr. Chairman, up through your committee with any possible recommendations as well. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just want to make those comments.
On the item, all in favor on 10.1. Okay, now we have an electronic vote, and it will carry. Okay, moved by Jackson, seconded by Whitehead. All in favor, and now we've already voted. And that carries. Lastly, we have before us amendments to the outstanding business list. If people can review that, and at the appropriate time, Councillor Whitehead just moved, and I need a seconder, and Councillor Pauls, that we approve the amendments to the outstanding business list, which is before you. All in favor? We need electronic vote. And that carries. Now we need a motion motion to adjourn, moved by Clark, seconded by Whitehead. All in favor? Carried. Thanks, everybody.